Welcome back to Exegesis. I have here Angela Engel, the publisher and founder of the Collective Book Studio. And recently she's written an article around book banning and sort of the problems that arise from that practice, especially in regards to Mouse in Tennessee. And I was curious to sort of think about, I know you mentioned before we started that you're the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. So why this book specifically, or is it books in general that are problematic to ban?
Oh, that's a huge question. I mean, I think in books, books in general, we have to kind of look at right now, especially the amount of LGBTQAI books that are being banned in schools. So it is a much larger issue than the Holocaust and Mouse and being banned. It's an issue about really you have to look at what is censorship and a ton of different things. And usually when it's a marginalized group, there's been a history of banning those stories and banning those books. The whole idea of burning books in Germany, was to really sort of make sure that Jewish intellectuals and thinkers, as well as people who are in the gay and lesbian community, right, in the Holocaust, and people of color, those books were being banned and those books were being burned. And so I almost look at banning books is in some way equivalent to the idea of burning books.
Yeah, I mean, there's conceptualizing how communities build their own language and stories, and then when you start taking away their literature or their recorded versions of those stories, you get to impose your own language on them, right? That's like a classical colonial kind of move. You sort of give the people you take over a new language, a new sort of reference point to help destroy what came before.
Exactly. And I think why I wrote the op-ed piece in Publishers Weekly about Mouse in particular was that I was watching it rise on these bestseller lists when it wasn't like, maybe they sold 2 or 3 a week right on BookScan, and then all of a sudden they're selling hundreds, if not thousands. And so there is definitely backlash that happens. But at the same time, my stomach was kind of churning, right? My stomach was churning because it hit home for me as a child of a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. And the fact that my grandmother in Germany, all of the stores that they owned, her father was Joseph Cohen. They had several stores, were all burned down in Kristallnacht. I think I had to react because I've always very touted that I'm an independent press. I'm a woman-owned press, but I never came out as like a Jewish woman-owned press. And that was like, the reality is I couldn't kind of separate what I do, which is I make books, I publish stories. I have a lot of Jewish authors, I have Jewish content. And so in the industry, in the publishing industry, which I've been in for over 20 years, I kind of needed to also step into who I was and saying, I'm also a Jewish woman, and this is important for us to really look at, that it's not just something to sweep on the rug like another banned book or burned book, that there's real anti-Semitism going on in the United States. And I wanted people to kind of address that.
Do you think, also being the grandson of Holocaust survivors, do you think we have sort of a specially tuned sort of fork towards what may or may not be anti-Semitism? Do you think that, for example, banning this book, maybe we're blowing it out of proportion? I know, there are numbers that come in about the rise in anti-Semitic incidents throughout the country, but do we do a good job of sort of balancing fear with reality, or how do you sort of see that?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote about that in this piece, right? I wrote this and I had to really think about this. I am a progressive. I've done whatever, the leftist, whatever, the activist, like my mother, although she was born in Herzliya in Israel, she moved when she was 7 to New York City. She was at Woodstock. I used to protest when I was little about Operation Rescue and women, pro-choice, we were those Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of Jews, right? Like I've been written an article, like I happen to have Ruth Bader Ginsburg earrings. Like I just am that kind of Jewish thought leader and woman, right? And so when I wrote this article, this was where I really noticed I'm allowed to call out anti-Semitism. My children, to this day, when we go to services and we go to a conservative synagogue, there's security guards, and that's considered normal, right? There are security guards at our preschools. We up security. We talk to the police, the head of Oakland Police Department when it's our high holidays. We are scared to wear our kippot walking down the street. I mean, that is a reality that we all feel as Jews. And so we kind of have to start talking about this, right? Like, it's not just being scared. It's like we've almost been conditioned, like that's normal. Like, my husband speaks Hebrew, his mother, he's Mizrahi. And, you know, there are places in Oakland, he is more apt to not try to speak Hebrew with his children than other places. And we live in a very liberal city. And so I sometimes look at, you know, for Jews now in the United States, anti-Semitism is on both the left and the right. And so how do we really fit in right now in contemporary politics and dialogue?
It's interesting that I think a lot about, not that, you know, if you're looking back towards the Holocaust, right? Of course, there was the two schools of thought as to how much should Jews integrate versus how much should Jews stay separate, and how does that affect our relationship with other people and their sort of in turn hate or not hate of the Jewish people. And so it's curious to me that we do seem to be having a resurgence now when perhaps Jews are more seen or more spoken about than they were in the past. I don't know how to sort of balance those two ideas, that we're sort of more integrated perhaps in America nowadays, and yet still anti-Semitism seems to be getting worse.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting because so the type of publishing we do, which is considered very trade, very gift ready, right? Not academic. So like we have a book that's amazing called B is for Bagel by a Jewish writer. It's done great. It's been in great Jewish media. It's a children's book, but it also has recipes. And I think about that voice of Rachel Teachman, and what my platform is able to do is sort of just kind of give pop culture, the bagel, right, to everybody. So everyone can kind of associate, or the media can write about a Jew and a bagel. Like, that's easy, right? But and then the Holocaust is like a really big, heavy thing. So what else is our stories, right? Is Shabbat, right? So we have this beautiful cookbook called 52 Shabbats. But when I really think about it, how many non-Jews really have experienced Shabbat? Very, very few. And even in my world, where we're, you know, considered like what I don't even know what conservative Judaism is. It's considered observant for some and not observant for anybody, you know. We don't keep Shabbat, and yet we have Friday night, a challah every Friday. My family lights the candles every Friday, and we sing it. But how many non-Jews come to it? I could probably count on one hand how many non-Jewish families who I'm friends with have actually been to my own home on Shabbat, right? And so I think that is interesting to me, that we're part of society, and yet we still are very careful who we invite into our homes, into our rituals, and we tend to invite people who have already some form of Jewish connection, right? Either one of their spouses is Jewish, or their partner is Jewish, or they have come from a Jewish family. And so it is something to think about as we go into 2022 and there's anti-Semitism. How can we invite more people in and that's one of the ways I believe we do, is through books and literature.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very weird, Judaism is a sort of weird religion in that it's not a proselytizing, right? We're not meant to convert. And in fact, there are laws about how you're not supposed to teach non-Jews, Torah and things of that nature, and how you interpret that law is, of course, up for debate. But there is sort of an apartness that seems to be inherent to the religion. And I wonder if it's a chicken and egg kind of question. Is it that we suffered so much and therefore we sort of learned and then incorporated into our own practice sort of to stay separate? Or is it that we stayed separate and that causes sort of our divide with others?
Yeah. I think, it's interesting to think about as humans, right? We like are very tribal in some way, and Jews were really tribal. And so you think about how we get along or how we talk or all those things, that they become stereotypes. And yet how do we in some way perpetuate them? Like I think about my own closest friends here in the Bay Area, they are Jewish, right? And it's because there's something in similarity that we understand about each other. And I think that is very common among all races and people, because we want to be by people that are familiar, right? That understand us. And so I think the harder part is that then stereotypes kind of sneak in. And so how do we break those down? It's through books, it's through dialogue, it's through being open-mindedness. I think that we often are so bombarded by social media and the news, and we sometimes have to step away from those things and actually get to know people.
Yeah, I mean, on your point on literature, it's also very interesting in the sense of almost, it seems that there are like 2 or 3 big Jewish writers at a time, but they never seem to be sort of like a cadre or swath of multiple types of Jewish writers. It sort of seems like maybe 1 or 2 are picked as sort of like the Jewish writers, at any given, for example, like in the 20th century, like Chaim Potok or that kind of thing. Whereas perhaps other cultures do a much better job of getting more people out there. So I wonder if sort of we could do a better job of getting a diverse array of Jewish voices that would help break those sort of stereotypes as we're going through currently.
Yeah, I love that idea, because I think we do a good job in Jews in entertainment and comics, right? But we don't do it in writing. We're very specific. We have like Elie Wiesel, right, who wrote Night. But we don't, or we have academics, I would say. We're very good at establishing Jewish thought leaders within the academic space, but we don't do it actually in the mainstream pop kind of stuff, unless it's like, a pop band or a comic. But what are we doing really to establish Jewish writers who are poets, who are short storyists, who also write in the nonfiction space, in the art space, in the cooking and lifestyle space? That's the children's space. I mean, that's really an interesting idea, one I'd love to crack.
Yeah, no, I think about it a lot, especially talk about this all the time with my wife or with whoever. Like a lot of the Jewish portrayals that we've gotten in the last, let's say, 5 years have been quite negative, in the sense of a lot of it is surrounding people who've left a more religious community and the problems with the religious community as seen through those who leave's eyes. So for example, Netflix had a couple of different documentaries
Yes.
or shows about that, and that seems to be like sort of, I can't tell if it's a Jewish problem in that it's specifically Jewish, or just people don't like more fundamentalist religion, and that's sort of how it's being pushed. But it does seem like Jews are taking some sort of rap somewhere along the way about being problematic, at least for sure, as you get more and more religious. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but I always think about that every time I see another one of these sort of shows or books pop up about how many of them are written about just how problematic the community is.
Yeah, I mean, even if you look at Miss Maisel, right? Isn't she not Jewish, the main character? I mean, it is, and I actually am a fan of Miss Maisel. I'm not saying I'm not, but it's the stereotypes of, Joel that we continually, Miss Maisel's husband, that we continually see in the movies. And I think we have to remind each other of that. And so for me as a publisher, for example, I have a Jewish comic who wrote a children's book, and he's also a dentist, and it's called Enamel the Camel. He's really funny, Mike King. It's brand new. And he happens to be a Jewish dentist who's really, really funny. And we wrote and published a children's book. And I think when you get me thinking about this, it's like, what are we doing as a Jewish culture to sort of say, hey, how do we create community? How does Mike King kind of talk to Rachel Teachman, who's another Jewish children's author, and B is for Bagel? And how there's a PJ Library, there's actually a trip you could apply for Jewish, creators to go to Israel. And I've actually sent that to a couple of my authors, because I want them to form community, my own authors, and build community around the categories that they're in. Because ultimately these stories have Jewish principles. I talk about this too. Like, people asked me this question. I think I was asked once on a podcast or an article, or maybe it was Hadassah magazine. Hadassah magazine, asked me this question that I thought was interesting, is about when I acquire, like, what are the Jewish values? And I said, I think I see through tzedek, tzedek tirdof, which was actually part of my Torah portion, justice, justice shall you pursue. I see that in everything I do. So even if the author is not Jewish, I ask myself, how is this good book going to make a difference in the world? And so in that, I feel I'm leading my publishing program with Jewish principles.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea around the concept, because I was thinking a lot about this conversation before we met, and sort of the idea of, does Judaism have an inherent problem with banning books or banning texts or censorship? That's something that I think about a lot, and I don't know if I have an answer, because I do think that there are instances where we do ban, or there are ideas that we don't support, and then say you shouldn't be studying these things, you shouldn't be learning these things. So I do think it's an interesting sort of concept that you're bringing forward, in the sense of, like, a Jewish idea is to sort of allow for books to survive or ideas to survive. But I would push back, perhaps, I don't know, is that fully the case, or how do we sort of balance those two ideas together?
Yeah, I mean, I happen to always love the idea of the jars, right? That the world was 7 glass jars and 1 shattered. And our role as a Jewish people is to pick up the glass shards, to kunolam. So I think that very clearly. So even a children's book like we have called Gratitude the Great, which is a beautiful book. Hope is from Brazil. She's a cousin, and Frankie, and it's very California, like those kinds of concepts, of social emotional learning concepts, I think are actually embedded in Judaism. So why would I publish that book? It's because I believe that the social emotional aspect to kids is something that I've been put on this earth to do, kind of pick up that chart. So I believe that, like, I happen to be of the mindset in Judaism, rather look at the text as a base of how then we can take it into the modern age. Don't forget, I'm modern Judaism. I mean, look at Malka's Notebook, something I recently published. It actually came to me as a memoir and these prose and all these art. And I actually do not think it would be in the format that it's in unless the publisher was Jewish and I saw something there, right? I saw something within the text that I said, this is a coming of age story, sort of like what I would compare when I read Anita Diamant's The Red Tent. And I fell in love with that book when I was probably about 19 years old. And I saw in Malka's Notebook that we recently published that same kind of concept of the coming of age of the young Jewish girl that is outside of that sort of idea of that very religious, you're right, person out of New Jersey or Brooklyn. That said, those same ideas of Anita Diamant's The Red Tent or Malka's Notebook, or what I'm talking about, are things in our ancient Torah, or things in our ancient text, are like Devorah, the judge. So I don't think when we talk about, unfortunately, when we see these Netflix shows, we're talking about a very small percentage of Orthodox Judaism that actually is different than even what I read when I read the Torah. Like, I literally was at Shabbat at a bat mitzvah last weekend, and I loved the bat mitzvah speech. It was about the Devorah the judge. And, and I see these young girls reading the text and interpreting it in a way that makes sense. And I hope that that's sort of some of the things that I would rather see on mainstream media, but we're not seeing.
Yeah, so I guess we have to do, part of the Jewish Literary Journal, I know, is to sort of get that back. I mean, I always say, I'm always looking for a good psalm or like a good something
Yes.
written by somebody nowadays that's sort of more, I don't want to say canonical because obviously the canon is set, but in that vein of the idea around how do we take Judaism and approach it seriously, not only from like a technical or sort of heady space, but like actually a deeply religious space. And I think that that's sort of interesting that we don't really get the sort of religious aspect of things in the modern media. I think a lot of it becomes sort of tokenism or culturally Jewish, but not necessarily integrating or dealing with the actual religious aspect and what that might look like. The actual spiritual, metaphysical sort of nature of a religion, specifically Judaism in this case, but even other religions also seem to shy away from that idea in the modern culture. And so, yeah, I wonder also
Yeah, no, this
how we
is
can
a,
do that.
yeah. Oh, is the connection a little, I might turn off my video just because you might have to edit this part. Hold
That's
on, let me turn off my video. Okay, is it stronger now? I might have a weak connection. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I think it's
Okay,
okay.
I'm turning. Okay, good. Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, where were we? I think you're on this. This is a really good philosophical question about like how do we infuse into media instead of the idea they lap onto banning books, right? Or we lap
Mhm.
onto the ultra religious. How do we sort of, I think, talk about Jewish culture in a different light? And I think 52 Shabbats, the cookbook that we did, has a ton of different essays from around the world, and I think it's did really, really well. Is because people are generally interested in Jewish culture and food and and entertainment, but I think that it's also something that um, something that we don't often know how to share. And so I think it might be, it's for me, I'm looking for ways to be creative where it feels more accessible to a larger group than just the Jewish people. Does that make sense? So B is for bagel is like anyone can access it. 52 Shabbats from around the world, anybody, you don't have to be Jewish. So I think that's important to me to sort of publish pieces of work that are giving people a look into Judaism that don't necessarily have to be Jewish. And it's a very positive look, right? Malka's Notebook, a very positive look at Judaism. It's sort of, that is one key goal that I have.
Yeah. So speaking of sort of these ideas around publishing, can you tell a little more about the book collective and sort of what you guys do? I know we have lots of writers who come to the Jewish Literary Journal hoping to sort of springboard from us to a more serious type of publishing. So I didn't know if
Yeah. So we don't do fiction. That's really key, or memoir. So if people are listening, that is not my, I could refer people, but that is definitely not my cup of tea. I do a lot of children's nonfiction, self-help, cooking and wine. We do some crowdfunding, especially around children's. We've had launched Kickstarter campaigns, which also are really good with from a marketing perspective. I call myself a partnership publishing. So we come up with a budget and, we hire everybody from the editorial to the design. We do all the production. We make beautiful offset books, and then we have full trade distribution. And so my model, I tend to shy away from the word hybrid, but yes, it's probably an easy way for people to think, well, what is the Collective Book Studio? But we're really what I call a partnership, because I look at the end goal and the why. And let's say, you're a musician and you don't want all of your lyrics taken for this book and adapted, and you want to own the intellectual property. So I do a lot of creative deals around that, so that entrepreneurs, musicians, brands actually own their IP, and they can make t-shirts, or we do a lot of work for hire. So I think it's a very different way of actually looking at the work and the intellectual property for people. Maybe they want to make a Netflix show or a film. That's why Mira came to me, is she has a film, right? She doesn't want a traditional publishing house acquiring all the art. So that's a huge difference. Or Rachel Teachman with B is for Bagel, she's able to use all the photography. She sells t-shirts, hats, earrings. She's blowing up on Etsy. She actually got invited to the Bagel Fest, which is happening in Brooklyn for 3,000 people, So I think what I'd say to your listeners is, if you have another end goal and the book is part of that, we're a really good option, because then we take care of a lot of things, like we're your megaphone into the Strand, which B is for Bagel is getting reordered all the time, or the Jewish museums, or Barnes and Noble and Amazon. Of course, I always say Amazon will buy everything, so let's not worry about that account, and let's really focus on where your consumers are.
Yeah, excellent. I'm sure you will get plenty of emails from people in the community that have plenty of questions. That seems to be, I would think, other than just technical questions around our journal, that would probably be the. It's interesting you were mentioning before about like community of Jews and writers. For so many Jews and writers, it seems to be a lot of people don't actually have the window into sort of the business. There's agents and there's people, but there isn't really a good sort of like, I don't think there's a really good way that we network necessarily specifically about Jewish work to Jewish, agents who might have Jewish publishers, and sort of be building those gaps. So that would be an interesting thing to sort of see develop.
Yeah, I would love it. I mean, I really love Jewish content. It's really about, for me, how I can think about it to make it ready for a larger audience. Look, the nice thing is, what's wonderful about the Jewish people is that we love to read. So we have a really good base. But I think what's the issue is that it is true. It is hard to sometimes talk about Jewish stories in more of a mainstream light. And so how are you going to talk about Tu B'Shvat, right? With people who are not Jewish, that have never. But let's think about Tu B'Shvat and the idea of how to twist that. What a cool book that, if it came to me about a tree and growth and loving the land, and we could still take the Jewish artist and the Jewish thinker, that I think is the magic that my team does. We're able to sort of think about it in a way of, how can we take some of these things and make them more accessible? So I invite that, if people want to get a hold of us and are like, hey, I've been actually really thinking about a certain topic, and ways that we can kind of branch out and make it, where we can sell 10,000 plus copies of their book. That's the goal.
Excellent. Where would they find you?
So I am just the collective.book.studio, or the collectivebook.com. And then we are on Instagram at the Collective Book Studio. And then I'm really accessible on LinkedIn. It's just Angela Engel. I love LinkedIn. If people ping me there. And then we have a submissions page on our website. We can put it in your show notes. I always encourage people to look at the submissions page, because they can really see what we're looking for. For writers, it's often, what's your vision? What's your why? You don't need a full manuscript at all, but you at least need minimum your vision, your synopsis, maybe a table of contents, and a sample of writing.